strip everything back to first principles. What's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the evidence that you have that you are solving that problem? And then what is your evidence that this is better than the existing way that that problem is solved? Very often, we're not creating products that solve a problem that has never been solved before, although sometimes that happens. But very often, there is already a workaround in place. What is the evidence that yours does it better? Right? And that's not the same as does it work, right? Or how does it work? We're not even bothered about that. We're just going to assume from a first principles perspective that this technology works. So what's the problem? What's your evidence you actually are solving that problem? And what's your proof that you're better than existing?
Welcome, medtech gurus. Today, as I mentioned in the introduction, we have a dynamic and accomplished guest with us. Elizabeth Chabe is joining us. She's the CEO of High Touch Group, and she's been disrupting the innovation landscape since she was a child, beginning college at just 12 years old and then launching her first business even younger at 9. And since then, she's become a national recognized expert in science marketing and commercialization strategy. Over the past decade, Elizabeth has helped research institutions and medtech startups secure more than $1 billion in funding, bringing complex innovations to market and breaking records like driving revenue growth at the Jackson Laboratory. Her group has been featured in the New York Times, Entrepreneur, CNBC, and Popular Science, amongst others. At High Touch Group, she leads a team of focused individuals on transforming scientific breakthroughs into compelling, market-ready narratives that drive both impact and adoption. Hey, Elizabeth, are you ready to be our guru today?
Sure, Tom. Thanks for having me.
We're excited to have you. So tell us something fun or interesting about yourself or your family so we can get to know you a little better.
Sure. I have 4 dogs in my house right now. So when I'm not doing work stuff or writing a book, writing my next book, I am doing a lot with dog rescue communities, mostly here in Mexico, but also in Asia, where I have family and another business. And so I have 4 living with me right now. One is my stepdaughters, a little Chihuahua named Lady. And then I have a Malinois mix named Flocka. And then Carlos, a little Chiweenie, completely extraneous dog. And a little street dog named Winona. So we've got 4 little street dogs.
So the operative word there, I think, was little, because I've got a daughter that rescues dogs, and she's got a Mastiff, right?
Oh,
Which is a handful, let me tell you. So,
I bet that's a big one.
Yeah, we long for the Chihuahuas, maybe, I think, for when we dog sit. So, well, good for you for doing that. That sounds like a lot of fun and very rewarding to boot.
It is. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, Elizabeth, you've had really an extraordinary path as I did my research. I mean, college at 12 and your first business at 9. So how did that early start really shape your approach of leadership and entrepreneurship and innovation? Can you help us out with that story?
Sure. I think that anytime somebody is doing something for a long time, even if it's starting when you're 20, but you've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, right? You develop certain patterns and behavior. One early pattern in my behavior that I had was, and still have, is trying to figure out different or better ways of doing things. And so I started college pretty young. I started companies pretty young. And that really gave me a bias for action and for trying to figure out ways. I don't want to say around the rules, because we are in a regulated space, so that's not necessarily true, but different ways of thinking, right? And so when you're 9, you're not old enough for a bank account. You can't sign any business papers, right? So, there are things you have to figure out. You have to figure out your own way of how to set up companies, set up bank accounts, handle those logistics. The same thing with university. It's actually very difficult for you to register for courses at a young age. Sometimes they'll have special programs for high school kids, right? But anything younger than high school, you need a lot of waivers and paperwork and things like that. So I think really starting businesses young, starting college young, it just taught me there's always a way around what they say is possible. And it's very important to keep an open mind and to play different scenarios and see what ends up working, because that flexibility and thinking, I think, is very important in the entrepreneurial world as well. And certainly when you have science-based products that may not come out of R&D the way that the founder necessarily plans. So I think it really set me up to approach my work life, my career, very flexibly.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you're explaining it, I was thinking about, how many times do we hear the statement of, "Oh, you'll never be able to do that," or "That's impossible," or insert no here, right? And
Mhm.
what I think you're saying is you learned how to kind of navigate around some of those no's. Am I heading down the right track with that?
Absolutely. So, how do you get past no? How do you negotiate a better position for you, a better outcome? And how do you get comfortable with ambiguity? Maybe you can't approach a business the same way as everybody else. That's fine. How can you approach it? And so, I think you just end up developing a certain comfort level with that. And I think it's also important that, you're taking risks and you sort of encourage other people who maybe are taking a risk or are doing something different from the norm. It makes you resonate a little bit more with people who are doing different things, which I think also ends up making you a good fit for working with other entrepreneurs.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And then, as I did my research, I noticed you founded a high touch group to help science driven companies tell their stories, which I found intriguing. So, why is it so difficult for technical teams to really communicate their value? And what are the keys to doing this well? Can you provide us some insights there?
That's a really good question, Tom. Technical teams are trained to solve hard problems, to validate their products, validate the answers to those problems with data, not necessarily distill those solutions into a compelling story. And there's often this fear that if you are dumbing down the data, that you're sacrificing some level of accuracy. But clarity sometimes does mean simplification, not necessarily oversimplification, but it's in making that science actionable for whoever's at the other side of the table, whether that's an investor, whether that's a clinician, whether that's a regulatory reviewer. And the key is really to lead with the impact of what your tool, if we're talking about a life sciences tool company, or your service or your product provides, what changes if somebody's using your product. Why should the person at the other side of the table care? And if you can't answer that in plain, non technical language, then you're likely not quite ready to pitch yet. And so that's where a lot of my work with, especially early stage founders, and I work less and less with the early stage founders these days, and a little bit more with companies that are probably past their Series B, Series A, Series B level. Maybe they're positioning for an acquisition. Maybe it's a mom and pop tools company, as we might say, founder started, founder led. But now that founder wants to exit or maybe do something different with his or her life. And so I work with a lot of companies at that stage. And really, at that point, they understand product market fit. So it's a little bit less about what changes for the customer when they use your product. And it's more about adapting that message for those different audiences. So it's the same sort of idea, teaching a technical team to communicate value, but it's often supported by just a longer corporate history. So we have more examples to pull from, more ways to make that story compelling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. And let me try it this way. When I think of that, I think that sometimes when the founder or the chief science officer, whatever, is talking to a group, they're speaking their language. And often the folks on the other side of the auditorium or the dais are speaking the language of finance, right? So it's almost like, French to Portuguese or something, maybe even worse, right? Is that heading down the right path? We got to speak the same language?
I love that, Tom. And so I live in Mexico right now, but before that, I lived in Vietnam. I've lived in 16 countries, and I'm from the United States, from Maine. And not only when you're living in these other countries, do you have that language barrier, so from English to Spanish or from English to Vietnamese, right? But there's also a cultural difference, and we see this as well if we're talking to venture capital on the other side of the table, or we're talking to private equity, or we're talking to a potential acquiring company, a strategic diagnostics company, for example, or medtech company that you're trying to have acquire you. No matter who it is on the other side of the table, unless you're also from that world, the language changes, but also some of the cultural norms are different as well. Mm-hmm. And a great example would be very often we're working with companies that are building on a process that already exists, right? So maybe you have a better mousetrap, as they say. So maybe you have a special take on limbs, or you have a special homebrew reagents that you're trying to scale. These are some kind of early company examples, but these technologies, very often, if you're trying to sell software, you're not just talking to a PI, like PI to PI. Here's why I developed this. Here's how your lab could use it. That's even if you're not talking the same language, using the same words, culturally, you sort of understand what their problems are. But you also might be selling to IT. That company may need your software to go through an IT process, and IT is going to have a different language than you, as maybe a past PI, might have talking to another PI about this process improvement product. So I think that there is the actual words, the language, and then also that cultural difference in the types of communication that are expected. We see this a lot in the investor space, right? Just thinking about VC versus private equity as just two examples. And you can see kind of right away, if you've been in those rooms, what some of those different cultural expectations are and how they might change the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's the culture from companies, but there's also the culture from professions too, right? So yeah, we see that from time to time. And then, building that too, I was interested in, our audience is a lot of innovators, a lot of entrepreneurs or soon to be entrepreneurs. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what you have found are some of the bigger mistakes that medtech innovators make when bringing a new solution to market. Can you give us any coaching there?
Yeah, another great question, Tom. There's so many of these mistakes, but I would say the biggest really is about focusing, and this is speaking in general terms in medtech, but really focusing heavily on features and not necessarily the product value. So assuming that if the science is good, if the data looks good, then adoption will follow, because it rarely works that way. And I think another very common mistake, especially for early companies, is this mistake of trying to appeal to everyone instead of getting really nuanced around customer segmentation and their pain points and how your product solves for those pain points. And then, sort of adjusted to this or related to this is you might have a product, and I see this a lot in diagnostics, for example. You know that there is a need for a particular type of diagnostic, and you know that you have the expertise to develop it on some underlying technology, NELF, LAMP, what have you. But as it turns out, the clinician doesn't necessarily, that diagnosis in the clinician's view isn't necessarily going to change treatment strategy. So, there are all of these little disconnects, and they kind of all circle around knowing your audience, knowing your customer and what they actually need, and understanding the value that your product provides. So in an early company, a venture, I'll put my VC hat on because I am on a VC board when I'm not doing high touch stuff. From a VC perspective, we think about this as early product market fit indicators. Does the founding team understand where their product fits into the ecosystem, into the market, what problems it solves, who their end customer is, how they're going to pay for it, how they're going to buy it. But the impetus of the entrepreneur to understand or at least be ready to answer those questions, and then hopefully have some validation that's already taken place. I can't tell you the number of times I'm on a Zoom now, or sometimes at Bio or ADLM or what have you, speaking with a prospective client, and I ask simple questions like, "Have you spoken with a prospective customer about this product?" And the answer is almost always no. Almost always no, because in their mind, they have validated that the product works because it works in their mind, in their lab, in their workflow, or because they heard something and they know the science works. So why wouldn't they like this? But at the end of the day, understanding your customer and whether there really is a need for your product is so important. And, I could say this about any industry, really, for any startup, but I'd say in medtech, it's especially prominent because you can make a very compelling case that we need certain, wearable devices or diagnostics on paper and get your grant funding, get out of your, get to the point where you're ready to spin out of an academic lab, for example, only to find out that there really is no need from the clinician side for this product. And we see this a lot in medtech, and it's really something that can spell death for otherwise good technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to just peel that back a little bit, is it sometimes motivated by they're afraid about their IP? However, they're sacrificing that to get that customer feedback, right?
Yes. And, there are great ways to design surveys and conversations with prospective clients without giving away the farm, so to speak, from an IP perspective. But it is very easy to come up with good ideas, and it's very hard to get those ideas working. And then it's even harder to get commercial adoption for those same ideas or those same products. And so just because you have the product idea and you understand how you would make it work doesn't mean that it's going to have a market fit. So if you can't validate that, you probably shouldn't be spending other people's money or your own. A lot of founders are bootstrapping, putting things on credit cards, doing friends, family, local angel networks to get these companies out of the lab stage or off the ground if it didn't start in an academic lab. And that can be, someday you're going to have to call those people and say, "Hey, sorry, we found some really basic problems with this product, like clinicians don't want it." And that's a terrible thing to have to report back. So you avoid all that heartache by having those early conversations.
Yeah, that's great advice. And you touched on funding here, and you and your team, you've secured over $1 billion in R&D funding, right? Which is an amazingly impressive number. But I'm wondering with that, so many times the founders are thinking about certain pathways, right? I got to go and raise money through a VC fund or an angel group or whatever, what have you. So can you help us out with any alternate strategies or overlooked pathways that you might recommend for some of our gurus out there trying to fund innovation?
Sure. The first step, especially if you're very early stage, is to look for non-dilutive funding sources as early as possible. And this is especially true, I think, outside of the US, but also inside the US. Inside the US, this could mean SBIR or STTR grants. So this could also mean disease foundations. It could mean industry consortia. There are various public-private partnerships, economic development grants that most states have. There are often also university-funded spin-out type like tech transfer programs that help fund certain parts of your business. And if you are at an academic lab, either because you're a grad student or a postdoc or because you're faculty, you also have a lot of resources at your university. And while you might be chomping at the bit to spin out of there as quickly as possible, you do have things like typically IP attorney access through technology transfer organizations within your university system. You have laboratories that are going to be less expensive, more cost effective for you to utilize now than as an industrial client to that same laboratory. So there are also a lot of questions that I tend to ask early stage founders that I'm advising. Is this the right time? Is this the right stage to even think about spinning out of an academic center if you're already there? Can you stay there a little bit longer before you spin out? But always look for non-dilutive first. And then honestly, most founders, if you are going to fundraise, especially with VCs, but also with angel groups, I don't know if founders quite understand. If you've never done it before, it takes a lot longer than you would think, than you would want. And it takes a lot out of you as a founder. There are going to be a lot of the same questions over and over again. You're likely going to be knocking on more doors than you think you are, giving a lot of presentations, waking up at weird times to do Zooms with somebody who's in Asia on vacation or whatever the situation might be, right? And it can take a lot out of a founding team. So if you are also responsible for hitting those scientific milestones for whoever else is funding you, for example, NIH or BARDA or somebody else, right? You really do, I think, have to think about, is this the right time for me to go out and raise? Because it takes a long time, it's exhausting, and what else are you not paying attention to? So really make sure that you're raising with a good story so that you don't have to be back out there every 6 months, kind of going back and asking for more money.
Yeah, I love that, raising with a good story, right? Because you're absolutely right. It does take a lot of time, and it takes a lot of that focus, right, to get that complete story out there. And you're going to all these conferences and you're traveling and you're doing all those things, right? Well, in the meantime, you better have a good, back office group really helping to support what you're doing.
Exactly. And very often, if you're an early stage founder, you're wearing all those hats. You
Yeah.
maybe have
Yeah.
one person supporting your team. So
Yeah.
definitely be efficient.
Yeah. And you certainly have to love what you're doing, right?
Yes. And you said
Yeah.
you're from Michigan, right, Tom?
Yes. I am.
Yeah, so Michigan and Maine kind of share some
Mhm.
similarities in some ways, both cold at least. But
Yeah. Right.
I think the other piece too is that you don't have to be in Silicon Valley to
Mhm.
to be a founder, and you don't have to use the Silicon Valley playbook to raise money. You really can, especially in medtech, you can look for aligned interests. You can look for economic development style opportunities that are often more founder friendly, and don't dilute your ownership too much of your IP or of the company. And so making sure that you're really putting together a fundraising strategy that pulls in from all these different resources and not just kind of looking at what some startup in the valley did.
Yeah, I love that because there's a lot of state-based funds for that economic development. So that's really good advice, and thank you for that. And then you mentioned the public-private partnerships. So I'm wondering, building those is obviously another strength of your company. So I'm wondering if you can just help tell the story just a little better in the sense of sharing an example where that approach really moves the needle for an innovation or a growth company. Do you have an example you can share with us?
Sure, sure. So there are a lot of these. One of the spaces before High Touch Group, I worked on Maine's largest R&D program. It's still their largest R&D program, a deep water offshore wind resource consortium, and this was called the Deep Sea Wind Consortium, and it comprised 36 different member organizations across universities, national laboratories, private sector contractors, builders, oil and gas companies, all of these different players. And what was interesting is with a project like that one that was incredibly multidisciplinary, it meant that you had just a really wide bench of resources. It wasn't just about, money and investment, although that's part of it, but you really had a wide bench of people you could call on to say, get a second opinion on something that you needed for a permitting process, or getting somebody else to be involved in a particular planning meeting that needed a special type of guidance. And so just having access to those resources can be really important. On the medtech side, we see this most often in events. We work on one event for a large diagnostics company, and they bring into this event key players across the industry, and what this means is they're able to get speakers on just very specific topics that might take months and months and months to try to find. But because they have that public-private partnership, essentially, that they've developed over the years, they're able to bring in the right speakers on very specific topics. They're able to amplify their messaging for this event sort of throughout the ecosystem to bring the right people to the event. And this is all to say that essentially you have a much deeper bench to call on when you need it. And you have, sometimes there are obviously formal agreements in place with these public-private partnerships, but very often you also form just a network. As an entrepreneur, you're probably not going to be, the primary player right away with an early stage company in one of these PPPs, but very often they can benefit a small company in a very lopsided way. So very often PPPs in the medtech space are worked out either through accelerator groups, industry organizations, regional organizations, and sometimes larger medtech companies that are sort of funding some level of like a thrust into a particular infectious disease space, for example, or global health initiative goal like antimicrobial resistance or similar. And so it can be a valuable opportunity for these younger companies, earlier stage companies, to build their networks, because it might be that in a few years you're knocking on doors for potential acquirers and suddenly you have a network. You also might be trying to gain insights into your market, and these PPPs kind of give you a lot of free information essentially about your market. And then lastly, there's often funding available through these PPPs. So it's another opportunity often for there to be non-dilutive funding or something funding adjacent, right? Like free marketing or support around IP or legal issues, kind of depending on the structure of the PPP.
Oh, that's really helpful. I really like that a great deal. And I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier in our discussion here. You're talking about the complex messages, right, with that broad bench. So, science is in scientific marketing is, so much more than just branding. So how do you help teams transform that complex science that you're talking about into messages that do resonate with investors, regulators, and clinicians? Can you provide us some insight there?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and we could talk. We could fill like
Yeah.
a
Whole
week's
nother
worth.
podcast on this, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, but this is a great question, and it's different with every product. But I will say that from a methodology perspective, my method really doesn't change much. At least the starting point here, and this is something founders can do independent of working with an agency, but really strip everything back to first principles. Okay. So at the core, forgetting all about how it works, forget all about that. If you strip away to first principles, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What's the evidence that you have that you are solving that problem? And then what is your evidence that this is better than the existing way that that problem is solved? So very often, we're not creating products that solve a problem that has never been solved before, although sometimes that happens, especially in biotech and medtech. But very often, there is already a workaround in place, right? So let's say you're developing a medtech product for CP patients that helps stabilize movements of limbic movement, right? Arms and legs and so on. There are other technologies out there that do that to a certain extent. So what is the evidence that yours does it better? Right. And that's not the same as does it work, right? Or how does it work? We're not even bothered about that. We're just going to assume from a first principles perspective that this technology works. So what's the problem? What's your evidence of that you actually are solving that problem? And what's your proof that you're better than existing? And then we think about your audience types. We talked a little bit about who are you talking to? Who's on the other side of that table? Very often, if you've developed a product for the first time, but you've never actually actually been on the commercial side of a therapeutic launch, for example, you don't necessarily know who you're selling to, but you, of course, know that you need clinical traction. You might need some level of reimbursement traction. You are obviously going to be talking to regulators. You might be talking to investors. And so after you've stripped everything back to first principles, can you then take that information and build parallel narratives for each of your audience segments so that you're telling the same story, just in different ways that resonate with the person you're speaking with from a cultural perspective?
Oh, that's really helpful, and thank you for that. And doing my research as well to build on that a little bit, you do often talk about the gap between innovation and impact, which touches that your answer here a little bit. But I'm wondering, what can we all be doing better to make sure some of this life changing technology and discoveries don't remain on the lab bench?
Go on Tom's podcast.
There you go. I love that.
No, but I mean more of this, right? I mean, you are out there talking to not just experts on the commercialization side, but also people who are developing new products, and you're providing a resource, right? And if you are looking for medtech podcasts, there really aren't that many out there, and
Mhm.
it's crazy to me that we don't have so many different specialized podcasts for not just on the entrepreneur side, but also for the science, for the technology itself. Especially, you would think post global pandemic, people might be more interested in, hey, well, what else could I diagnose at home? Where is that technology? So you see this a little bit in the quantified self movement, and these kind of like health and wellness gurus who are tracking everything, and that's where the public's getting their information about a lot of public health and health technologies, as opposed to from people who have actually been in the trenches developing these products and technologies for sometimes decades. And so I have to wonder what that information gap is going to cause from a public health standpoint, what problems it's going to cause. Because if you're getting all of your information from some YouTuber who's like 25 and has never done anything, right? I shouldn't have knocked that after saying go start businesses. If you're getting, you know what I mean? Like, there's a big difference between you've helped
Mhm.
launch, hundreds of successful products, to you have a successful YouTube channel that gets a lot of likes and you're the person that's giving out health advice to people.
Right.
I think there's a big problem there. And so I would like to say that one of the biggest calls to action all of us in the space can have is to be out there more, be in communities, be in science classrooms, be on podcasts, whatever it is, wherever you have wherever you feel like you can make the most impact, go out into those channels and make that impact. I think it's really important that we're all out there right now.
Yeah, that's interesting advice because I talk to a lot of innovators that find it very frustrating because trying to get to end users, trying to get to clinicians, especially since we had the pandemic, has become very difficult and remains so. Do you have any little other little tidbits that might help them navigate some of those challenges?
Yes. I think that, like all of us who have been in healthcare or healthcare adjacent for a number of years, everybody is working a lot right now and has been, especially during the pandemic, after the pandemic. From a public health perspective, there's a lot going on right now, and so clinicians, I think, are less open to having their time wasted. Right,
Mhm.
and they're very overworked, and the ones who aren't overworked often are in private practice and honestly might have less input for you just because of the patient population you're focusing on or what have you. So what I would recommend is stop filling their inboxes with junk. They don't need another email. I don't care how well written your chatbot made your lovely message, but they don't need that. Email's not a great way to reach clinicians anyway. If your work is of value to clinicians, then what I would do is start with your network. and get those introductions to the clinicians who are most like your prospective customers. They might not be the end users of your med tech, right? It might be their patients, but network with them, get introductions from people within your networks. This is a great opportunity to leverage alumni networks at universities. It's a great opportunity to investigate public-private partnerships and to go to those events. You don't have to always spend $3,000 on a medical conference ticket just to hope you rub elbows with somebody that's relevant to you, right? I don't think that that's a great method. But there are likely events that are closer to you with the right clinician subset for you. But figure out clever ways to meet those customers. And once you do, ask them questions, be engaged. It's pretty rare that I have ever had a clinician. In fact, I can count on my one hand how many times I've had a clinician just say, like, get lost. I'm not interested in answering any questions or having this conversation. Usually they're very interested in what's going on in the product development space. They just don't have time to go through their junk mailbox looking for your special email invitation to their survey. So don't be shy, have those conversations, ask for introductions from people in your network, and just be authentic in those conversations. Don't just blast emails.
Yeah, I love that, especially being authentic, right? Because I think if you're authentic, you can ask those questions, right? And that turns into that conversation, right? Versus just a basically an infomercial, right? That's not going to help anybody. So, but thank you. I love that, especially they don't fill up their email box, because I can't tell you how many times I hear, "Oh, you sent this email," right? And it just goes nowhere.
Yes. Oh man,
Yeah.
related to that, Tom, somebody just I made this comment the other day to somebody. I said, well, we're sent, don't send so many emails. This is kind of crazy. And they were like, you're right. We should try LinkedIn and send messages that way instead. Like, no, don't do that
No.
either. Just be authentic.
Yeah, exactly. Great advice. So, Elizabeth, this really seems like an exciting time for you and your team at the High Touch Group. What does the future hold? Where are you headed from here?
So we're doubling down on some of our core strengths. We do a lot of work in science-driven commercialization, as you know. So we don't just help companies launch products, but we're actively engaged with them on how their products essentially obtain commercial adoption. So I'm focused on growing our team's expertise and client base in certain key areas where I see growth. Outside of medtech, we actually do a lot of work in advanced materials. My R&D background way back in the day was on composites applied to structural applications. So we do work outside of medtech in aerospace, space tech, and some of these other areas where we are seeing just massive growth. And this is in part due to things like a lot more satellites being launched and all of this stuff. And obviously this drive for rare earth minerals and platinum group minerals, we're seeing a lot of that turn to space and asteroid mining and things like that. And these things might sound very sci-fi, but they're all things that are being funded right now actively. And there's a lot of really interesting developments from the product technology side in that space. So I'm really excited about what's going on there. MedTech, we're seeing a lot of movement outside of the United States, of course. So we're seeing, some unfortunate grants getting cut and lab closures and things like that in the US. I suspect that's going to reverberate, through private markets. We've already seen, obviously, biotech and medtech take a bit of a hit on the VC side of the funding equation over the last few years, especially since 2021. I don't think that there's any real silver lining there in the US necessarily. I think we're going to see that trend continue for a couple more years. But on the bright side, what we are seeing is a lot of US companies look at how their products can improve other markets worldwide. So a company that maybe was thinking about moving to the EU with a diagnostic, maybe in the 5 to 10 year horizon, well, now they're flipping that and they're engaging with CROs that are well versed in IBDR, for example. And so there's some exciting opportunities. And so I think it kind of is on the medtech community to really look for the opportunities in maybe a more constrained funding environment right now. So those tend to be geographic opportunities. And then I think that there's going to be a lot of really interesting developments in the health and wellness space. So potentially maybe some less regulated markets, some at-home care, at-home health and wellness type products. So I think those are likely still looking favorable to the investors that we're having discussions with currently.
Yeah, sounds like a really exciting time for you and your team, and you've got plenty going on to keep you busy.
Absolutely. It's a
Yeah,
fun
yeah,
time.
love it. So, Elizabeth, I'd first of all like to acknowledge and thank you for the time that you took to be our guru today. If somebody wants to learn more, how do they find out more? Is there a website or in LinkedIn? How do we learn more about what you and your team are up to?
Sure. So you can always go to hightouchgroup.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, Elizabeth Chabe. I also have a website, elizabethchabe.com. I'm a published author. So my book, The Giant's Ladder, is really targeted at early stage founders who maybe aren't quite ready to engage in an agency. And honestly, if you were to knock on my door, I'd probably say, no, go read this book. Here's a free PDF. Because a lot of these early stage companies really do spend a lot of time engaging with consultants instead of working through some of this themselves. And I really do think it's important to work through it from a founder perspective before you charge somebody else with working through it for you. And so The Giant's Ladder, it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. If you are a faculty member who has had budget cuts lately or a student, feel free to email inquiries@elizabethchabe.com and somebody on my team will send you a free copy.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, Elizabeth, once again, thank you so much. Really enjoyed our conversation, and I appreciate your being our guru today.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to MedTech Gurus. I am Sylvester Harris, your MC. If you want to learn more about Tom and his consulting services, you can go to www.pctmedical.com or email Tom at tom@pctmedical.com. Now, I can be reached at Sylvester Harris, that's SylvesterHarris 5048@gmail.com, and I'd be pleased to discuss any voiceover work that you may want for your company or broadcast. Hey, thanks so much for listening, and catch us on the next episode of MedTech Gurus.